So, hello everyone, and welcome to another video on typology. Today I want to look at Jesus and the high priest, basically his priestly aspect. So it's commonly Jesus is referred to as having priestly, prophet, and kingly aspects. And I want to look at the Old Testament and how the high priest foreshadowed the priestly aspect of Jesus Christ. And I want to talk about that in relation to the temple veil, because the high priest interacts with the temple veil, as you'll see later on. And then once we've sort of made that connection, high priest, Jesus, veil, we can also get an understanding of some peculiar images that you might have seen of Holy Mary spinning a thread or with a yarn in her hand. And so you'll see how that's all sort of connected. And then I want to finish up basically talking about how the temple veil has developed into early Christianity and over time into the different traditions. So sort of once you have that understanding, you know the theology behind the temple veil, and then you can see why some traditions have done certain things and why in others they take a sort of different approach to what should be between the people and the altar. Okay, so yeah, a caveat maybe, this is just a hobby of mine. So this is going to be quite a broad overview, and maybe the details, I hope they are right. But if I misunderstand anything or if I get anything wrong, please leave a comment. Let me know. That's part of the reason why I'm doing this is to basically learn. And before I start, another shout out that I have to give is to another YouTube Catholic channel. The Catholic Brothers, who are criminally underviewed. I don't know why they don't have more views and are not more popular. But anyway, check them out. I'll link them below. Okay, so I want to start with Abrahamic religion. So if we go back to Abrahamic religion, and that's Abraham plus his descendants, what they were doing was basically going around and meeting God in different places, right? They would have encounters with God. And once that happened, they would build a small shrine, a stack of stones. They would pour oil on it. They would consecrate that place, and they would name it after God, right? And so there was no fixed location for God's for an encounter with God, but rather they would meet him all over. And so once Mosaic religion came in, so with Moses, this aspect of moving around sort of still stayed, but now God was in some sense with his people. He was locally with them in the tabernacle, so in the tent, and this sort of moved around still with the people, with the Israelites. And then in the Davidic era, David's dream was to bring this, let's say, this mobile. You wouldn't say temporary, but I mean it's still a tent structure, right? So his idea was to bring it into Jerusalem and then erect a temple for the tabernacle and for the presence of God. And so although he laid the groundwork for that, he couldn't realize it, but his son Solomon did. And so that's when you get the first temple. So that's Solomon's temple, which was in Jerusalem. That was destroyed prior to the second temple being built, and that was a temple that was around during Jesus' time. And so there's a lot of differences between first and second temple, which are very, very interesting. I won't get into it, but please watch the videos from the Catholic Brothers, because it's quite illuminating into the differences between the two. So Solomon's temple had a 3-part structure. You had the forecourt, the sanctuary, and then the Holy of Holies, where the presence of God was in the Ark of the Covenant. So it was a richly decorated structure. You can see here it was covered in gold. It had engravings of lots of garden imagery to recall the Garden of Eden, because you're coming back into paradise. It had angels, and then within the Holy of Holies, you had the 2 cherubim on either side, and you had them also on the cover of the Ark of the Covenant, right? And so what's important here is that there was a veil that separated the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy of Holies, from the sanctuary. And the veil had 4 colors. And each of these colors, they represented the 4 elements of matter of which the world was created: earth, air, fire, and water. I mean, that was the ancient sort of, material understanding of the world, right? So the Holy of Holies wasn't accessible actually for most of the time. It was only one day a year, on the Day of Atonement, when the high priest would enter into the Holy of Holies to perform the atonement ritual. And so just a little bit about this atonement ritual, because it's important. So usually the high priest wore white linens, right? And white represents purity. It represents, some divine nature. I mean, when the angels appear in either Old or New Testament, they make a point to say that they're wearing white. So on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would, on top of his white garments, he would wear a colored robe. And this colored robe had the same 4 colors as the temple veil. And recall that the temple veil, the colors, they represent the 4 elements of earth, of matter, of physical reality. So basically what the high priest is doing is he's putting on matter. He also wears a breastplate with the 12 stones. That represents the 12 stones of the 12 tribes of Israel. So what would happen is that, and I need to get the order right here. So the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies. He would remove, so he crosses the material veil. He removes his material veil, so he's then divinized, right, in the presence of God. He puts it back on and he leaves, right? And so at this stage, he's deified, you can say. It's like when Moses goes up the mountain and comes back down with his face glowing. So now he's worthy to perform the sacrifice, which happens outside the temple, right? And so then he sacrificed the bull, the goat, and then he goes back inside with the blood. He crosses the veil, he disrobes again, at least his outer robes, and he sprinkles the the covenant, the Ark of the Covenant with the blood, the sacrificial blood, thereby atoning for his sins and the sins of his people. When we think of this sort of process, right, of putting on reality, putting on material, going into reality, performing a sacrifice, then going back into the Holy of Holies to offer that sacrifice as a remediation of sin, who does that remind us of? So, of course, that's Jesus. And as I mentioned, this is the foreshadowing of Jesus's priestly aspects. So, Jesus, of course, veiled himself, now in human flesh, to enter into the world and offer a sacrifice, but not of goats and bulls, but of himself, and not for the sins of a group of people, but for all of humanity. And so now we can go to Hebrews, because this was obviously not lost on the very first Christians, the apostles. So in Hebrews 4:14, we read, "Seeing then that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession." Then again we read, "Therefore, brethren, having boldness to enter the holiest by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way, which he consecrated for us through the veil that is his flesh, and having a high priest over the house of God," etc., etc., right? And so the crossing of the veil and putting on the garments then obviously represents the incarnation as well. So, you have that aspect of crossing the veil, making the sacrifice, using blood to atone for sin. That's one aspect. But then the very act of crossing the veil, I mean, that's a mystery in itself, a huge mystery and a very important cornerstone of Christianity. That's the incarnation itself, right? So, and we can look at John 1:14, for example. Jesus is the Word made flesh, right? The Word made flesh, that process is crossing of the veil. It was the high priest was doing when he crossed that veil, when he put on the garments. So obviously a lot can be said here, right? There's books written on this, so I'm not going to dwell here too long. But once we have this in mind, we can look at some other aspects before moving on to the temple veil itself. So we can see that if you have this understanding of Jesus' incarnation and temple veil, we can look at the tearing of the temple veil at Jesus' death on the cross as follows. The temple veil represents the interface between heaven and earth. So does the person of Jesus Christ, right? He is fully God and fully man. So when he dies, that separates. And if you remember that the high priest, once he offered the sacrifice outside the temple, he entered into the Holy of Holies. He crossed the veil. So Jesus is crucified outside the temple. Then he leaves his body to enter the Holy of Holies. But as he does that, he's not going to the Holy of Holies in the temple, in the second temple. in Jerusalem, he's going to the real Holy of Holies, right? In heaven. And so that crossing, that leaving of the flesh of his body and crossing to the real Holy of Holies, true Holy of Holies, renders the temple veil in some way void, right? Because now no longer do we need a priest, high priest, to go into the Holy of Holies. We all have access to it, as Saint Paul alluded to. Therefore, the temple veil tears, right? And so to drive this point home a little bit, we can look at the resurrection and the tomb, right? So here we have two angels on either side of the slab where Jesus lay, which remind us of the two cherubim which are around the mercy seat or the Ark of the Covenant. And what does Jesus leave behind? He leaves behind his garments, just as the high priest took off his garments in the Holy of Holies. Okay, so now we can look at Mary in relation to the temple veil. So you may have seen some images that have shown Mary basically, as I said, knitting, holding a yarn or a thread. In some icons or in some paintings, it's very subtle, right? You might miss it. And so maybe you can already begin to see that when we talk of the veil of heaven, earth, incarnation, obviously Holy Mary is involved, right? And tradition holds, when we look at the Proto-Evangelion of James, which is an early Christian document, a lot of traditions come from this document, it holds that Mary was one of the women who knitted the veil of the temple, since only virgins were assigned to this task. So if you think about it, Mary is here knitting the veil, right? That represents which represents is symbolic of matter, right? Through which the temple priest is in some way incarnated. In some way, he crosses into symbolically reality. Taking off and putting on of it is the interface between reality and divinity. So Mary, while she's doing that with her hands, within her, Jesus is being knit together, right? So commonly in the Old Testament, a baby is often referred to as being knit together in the womb. So it's just a really nice sort of symbolism of the role Mary plays in salvation history. Okay, so now we can move on to the veil itself, right? And here I want to talk about two sort of related aspects of the veil. They're two sides of the same coin, right? You can't actually talk about one with the other. Nevertheless, just for my presentation and discussion's sake, I'll do that. So one aspect is the separation, right? So you have the temple veil that hangs down, and it demarcates, it separates. The other aspect is a covering, right? So you have a covering that protects. It confers dignity, holiness, because you only really cover something that's worth protecting. And so I want to talk about these two aspects. I want to start with the covering aspect. So as I mentioned, it's there's a practical aspect to this of covering, because you want to protect it from dust, from wear. So my camera, for example, or even your phone, you put in a case, right? You're not going to put something that's not really worth protecting in a case, right? So you veil things that deserve to be protected, that are worth something. And if that's true for our objects, how much more true is that of God, right? So when the glory of God was present in Israel, of course they built the tabernacle and the tent in the desert, right? They covered everything. They covered the whole thing. And so this idea is obviously carried forward. So even in the temple, where that covering was no longer there, symbolically it was present. I couldn't find much images of it, but we can go to early Christianity and look how they interpreted that, right? So there are a few surviving examples to this day, but we can actually find some from as early as the fourth century. Holy sites were covered in a symbolic sense by a so-called ciboria. It's also known as the aedicule or the tetraphylon. So they were typically over the tombs of martyrs. And you can see that this is a martyr, and it's a little bit tricky to see, but there is a veil on top of him. And in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you also had a covering over the tomb of Christ himself. So over that slab, you can say. This is a reconstruction. So obviously, if you're placing that over sites of martyrs, which are which are sacrificial in nature, sacrificing in the name of Christ, then obviously that starts to appear over the altar where sacrifice is occurring as well. And so this develops over the centuries. So you get grand sort of stone ciboria, as you can see in these sort of early examples. And then as time goes on, Middle Ages and so forth, you begin to see it take a more symbolic sense. So you go back to sort of the stone ciboria obviously stay, but you also get sort of just sort of cloths hanging on top of the altar because it is a place of high significance that should be demarcated in the church as opposed to other areas. And then over the centuries, this aspect of covering the altar, I guess it fades out, right? Because we don't really see this much either in the sense that I've shown here, either in the East or in Western churches. However, it's retained in some aspects, right? It's become more subtle in some sense and more pointed. So if you look at a Eucharistic procession, you will often notice that the Eucharist is covered by this ciboria, this cloth, right? And it has 4 points. And so I didn't mention that, but generally you will always have 4 points. And this goes all the way back to the altar in the Temple of Solomon, which had 4 points. You have 4 rivers coming out of the Garden of Eden. You have the 4 corners of the earth, right? And so you have the 4 cardinal directions. It's a very symbolic number and a symbolic shape to have the 4 corners. And then we also see it basically in present-day Catholic churches over the tabernacle itself. The tabernacle is veiled, right? And so what we can see side by side is that actually in the Catholic Church, you have the veil over the presence of God, which is a fulfillment, a realization, a transfiguration of what was foreshadowed in the desert in the tent which contained the tabernacle. Okay, so now onto the veil as a dividing wall. And so now I'm talking more, as I mentioned, of the veil that sort of stands between, right? It originally, and in the particular context that I'm talking about, is in the Temple of Solomon, where it was between the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies, right? In some images and some sources, there was also a door there, but essentially it's the same thing. It's a barrier, right? That acts as a barrier. And so you can see this develop in the early church. So here are some artistic reconstructions and paintings of old St. Peter's and St. John Lateran in Rome, right? And so these are early 4th century. And you're seeing that this sort of aspect of a division is still there, but it's interpreted in a different way, right? So you can see through it. There's a barrier, but you can see through it, and it's quite elaborate. And obviously, you can see there's already sort of a tension here because you don't want to keep the veil up because it was torn, but nevertheless, it's still something that's holy, that's on the other side. And so this sort of tradition appears in the early church. And then you can see that as time goes on in the West, prior to about the turn of the millennium, so 1000 AD, you see chancel screens or rood screens appearing, right? And so these are just beautiful. I actually didn't know too much about them before the research I did for this video. And you can just see they're wooden screens that are between the sanctuary and the altar. You can see through them. They're decorated, and they really beautify the church. So once these elaborate rood screens started appearing in the West, they actually then spread eastwards, and that led to the development of the Iconostasis. And so these are obviously what we associate with Orthodox churches, this beautiful, the Eastern rood screen, the Eastern chancel screen, Iconostasis, with the icons that are facing us, right? And so I'm sure there's deep theology there that I'm just ignorant of, right? So eventually in the West, rood screens and chancel screens fell out of favor, not least due to the Reformation and the theology changing there. And that led us to altar rails. So what's interesting about altar rails is that actually some sources say that in the early church, so I'm talking like no images left, no pictures left, but in the early church, you actually had knee height or waist height barriers. So the examples that I showed you were very grand churches, right? There's the Basilica and Old St. Peter's. But in your parish church, you would just have a sort of a smaller screen. And so in some sense, this calls back to the early church more than a Rood screen does. But that by itself, I think, doesn't mean that that's what should be done, because things develop over time, right? The mustard seed, it grows to its full glory. But just an interesting aspect. So today in the East, you have the iconostasis maintained. However, in the West, the altar rails have also gone, right? They've disappeared pretty much. And as I mentioned, there's a certain amount of tension here. You can understand both sides, right? You can say, look, the temple rail was torn, so there should be no barrier between the sanctuary, between the people and the altar, right? It should just be free flowing, because Jesus, he did away with that, let's say, barrier. He gives us access to that which is holy, the most holy, the Holy of Holies. On the other hand, and something that I actually agree with, is that the Holy of Holies, the altar, and what's in the chalice is God Himself, and it's something that's very difficult for us to grasp, right? And it's not something we can just say, oh yeah, that's God there. Like we need, since we are embodied souls, we need we need signs, we need visible signs to point to invisible realities, right? So we as Christians have a sacramental worldview, so we need signs, symbols, sacraments to point us to the invisible reality, right? And this is true for everything. I mean, we could just spiritually receive communion. That is an option, and maybe some of you did that during COVID, but it's just not the same, right? It takes a lot more effort, and it's accessible to fewer people to get to that level. And so from this aspect, you can understand why you still want a division. However, what's important is that the division should be symbolically open. So for me, a perfect example is the Rood screen or the chancel screen, where you have something up, but you can see through it. And the sort of significance here is that it heightens or makes it more present how privileged we are in some sense. Because when you put up a barrier and you cross it, that's much more effective than not having the barrier at all, right? And just having free access. So when you have the Rood screen up, you can imagine that during Holy Week, it's veiled, it's covered. You actually can't see, right? But then during the Vigil Mass, the priest would walk through the veil. It would be through the veil he would walk with the consecrated host. I mean, that's just some powerful symbolism that would really evoke this Eucharist, this thanksgiving for what has actually taken place and what we are a part of. And we have to remember that although you have the screen up and you have a division in the old covenant, this would only occur once a year, and only one person would go into the Holy of Holies. Now, even if you have the veil up, it's happening all the time that there are priests going in and coming out with God Himself. So even if the screen is present, you still have this access, let's say, to God, right? Without any hindrance in that sense, because God is crossing that veil in every church every day, all over the world. So that was just a brief overview of the foreshadowing of Jesus's priestly aspect by the high priest in the Old Testament, and how that relates to the veil, intimately tied with the incarnation and with Mary as well, and how that sort of develops over the centuries in the church. So thanks for watching, guys, and catch you next time.